I had barely stepped out of my truck when I heard the knock. It wasn't the friendly kind of knock you get from a neighbor bringing cookies. It was sharp, impatient, almost like the person on the other side owned the place. I was still standing in the doorway, looking at my stack of moving boxes, when I opened it. A woman in a crisp blue polo shirt stood there, clipboard in hand, wearing a smile so forced it looked painful. Before I could even say hello, she jumped right in. "Hi, I'm with the HOA. There's a matter we need to settle right away. No welcome. No small talk. Just business." I blinked, wondering how she even knew I had arrived. I'd been here for what? 10 minutes. She didn't wait for me to answer before flipping a page on her clipboard and pointing to a highlighted line. "There's a new resident initiation fee," she said, voice sweet but firm. "It's policy. We'll need it in cash today to avoid a late penalty." Her tone was the kind people use when they're already expecting you to comply. Like she was telling me something obvious, something I should already know. Except, I'd never heard of such a fee. I let her keep talking, her words quick and rehearsed, like she'd done this dozens of times. Meanwhile, in my head, I was already running through the HOA bylaws I'd memorized over the years. Not from living here. No, this was my first day, but from something far more interesting. She tapped her pen against the paper, smiling just a little too much. "If you get it to me before 5 o'clock, we'll waive the processing surcharge," she added. Processing surcharge? For an initiation fee? That's when I knew exactly what this was. I looked past her shoulder. Out on the street, a couple of neighbors were pretending not to stare. A man mowing his lawn slowed down, pretending to adjust his mower height. They were watching, and not because it was a warm welcome. The woman must have noticed me glancing around, because she stepped a little closer. "I know it's sudden," she said, lowering her voice, "but this is how we keep the neighborhood running smoothly." I wanted to laugh. Instead, I tilted my head, as if I was just now processing her words. "Cash, you said?" I asked slowly. Her eyes lit up, like she thought she had me. "Yes, that's correct. $250. $250. In cash. To a stranger on my porch, with no invoice, no paperwork I hadn't seen before. And she was asking for it minutes after I'd arrived, before my furniture was even inside. I gave her the kind of smile that makes people a little nervous, the kind where they can't tell if you're about to agree or tear their argument apart. In my head, I was already picturing the next few minutes, and how quickly her day was about to change. I shifted my weight, leaning against the doorframe like I had all the time in the world. "So this fee," I said, "it's in the HOA documents, right?" Her pause was small, but I caught it. "Of course," she said quickly. "Standard procedure." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just a little too long. The truth was, I didn't need to look up those documents. I already knew them inside out. I knew every bylaw, every amendment, every hidden clause. Because this wasn't just my first day living here. It was also my first day living in an HOA I already worked with. And not as a member. I watched her straighten her clipboard, trying to regain whatever control she thought she had. She didn't know that my job, my actual job, meant I handled property contracts for several homes in this very neighborhood. She didn't know that I was the one who processed rent from these houses, rent that went through my office before the HOA ever saw a dime. And the funniest part? She was about to find that out in the most awkward way possible. I glanced at the moving truck still idling at the curb, the driver waiting for me to give the signal to start unloading. Boxes of my life stacked behind me, her pen hovering over her clipboard. It was like two worlds about to collide. Hers built on control and intimidation, mine built on knowing exactly who holds the real power. She thought she had found an easy target. She thought I was just another clueless new homeowner she could pressure into handing over cash without asking questions. But she was about to learn, some doors you knock on, you'd better know who's standing behind them. The week before moving here had been a blur. Packing boxes until my back ached. Sorting through old clothes I hadn't worn in years. Driving paperwork across town to make sure utilities were ready on day one. I thought the hardest part would be the drive and the unpacking. Turns out, the real surprise was waiting for me right on the front porch. This wasn't some random neighborhood. It was one of those carefully planned communities you see in glossy real estate brochures. Perfectly trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, lawns that look like they've never seen a weed. And right in the middle of all that perfection was a homeowners association that prided itself on keeping things in order. I already knew HOAs had a reputation. Over the years, I'd heard more than a few stories, Neighbors fined for having the wrong shade of blinds, people written up for planting the wrong kind of flowers, even someone forced to repaint their house because the color looked too cheerful. But what I didn't expect was for the HOA here to be this bold and this fast. Moving here wasn't some random decision. I'd been working in property management for a while now, handling leases and overseeing payments for multiple rental homes, some of which just happened to be right in this neighborhood. I wasn't just familiar with how HOAs operated. I'd been dealing with their invoices and correspondence for years. So when I pulled up that morning, I already knew more about this place than the average resident. I knew how many homes had been sold in the last year. I knew which properties were rentals. I even knew which board members were late on their own HOA dues. A little piece of irony I kept tucked away for moments exactly like this. The first thing I noticed after parking was how quiet it was. No dogs barking. No kids riding bikes. Just the low hum of air conditioners and the faint smell of someone's sprinkler system running nearby. I was halfway through my mental checklist, turn on the water, test the lights, start the fridge, when that knock came. She had the whole official look down perfectly. Logo shirt, badge clipped to her belt, clipboard in hand like she was about to deliver the 10 Commandments. The tone she used wasn't friendly neighbor, it was gatekeeper. Like she was the final stop between me and being a real member of the community. That's the thing about some HOAs, they rely on intimidation. They count on new residents being overwhelmed, distracted, and too polite to challenge them. And honestly, most people probably would have just handed over the cash without thinking twice. You're moving in, you don't want trouble, and the person in front of you sounds confident enough to make you doubt yourself. But the whole time she was talking, I was picturing the stack of documents I'd read when I first got this job. There was no initiation fee. There was no cash payment requirement. And there was definitely no processing surcharge for moving in. Still, I let her keep going. Because the more she talked, the more obvious it became that this wasn't some misunderstanding. It was a routine. I could hear it in the way she recited the numbers. The way she said policy like it was carved in stone. The way her eyes scanned my driveway, probably noting the moving truck, the boxes, the fact that I was still in yesterday's jeans and a t-shirt. She thought I was too busy, too tired, too distracted to question her. And honestly, that's how they get away with it. You target people at their most vulnerable moment, the first day in a new home, when they just want to settle in without conflict. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my voice casual. So this is in the HOA agreement? I asked. She nodded, quick and confident. I almost wanted to ask her which section, which page, which paragraph, but that would have ruined the surprise I had in mind. Because here's the part she didn't know. This HOA already sent rent checks to my office every single month. For multiple homes. I'd seen their payment schedules, their late notices, even their internal memos when board members couldn't agree on repairs. In other words, they didn't just know me as a resident. They already knew me as someone who had the power to hold up their own income stream if things ever got messy. But I wasn't going to drop that card just yet. Not until I'd let her dig herself in a little deeper. She must have taken my slow nod as agreement, because her shoulders relaxed just a little. That clipboard came up again, pen ready, like we were about to seal the deal. I didn't reach for my wallet. Instead, I asked her to show me exactly where this initiation fee was listed. That tiny pause between my question and her answer told me everything I needed to know. Her smile twitched for a second before she smoothed it back into place. "Oh, it's in the HOA policy packet," she said quickly. "We just don't send that part out to everyone until after the first payment." Interesting. I tilted my head like I was just curious, but inside, I was already pulling apart her story. HOA rules are public to all members, new or old. There's no such thing as a secret fee that magically appears after you pay it. But she said it with such certainty, like she'd rehearsed this answer for months. The air between us shifted. She thought she was steering the conversation, but I could feel her starting to sense that I wasn't the easy target she hoped for. Still, she pressed on, explaining that if I gave her the cash now, she'd personally make sure my name went on the good list. The good list? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. It just makes things smoother. No delays, no questions, no inspections. She said that last word slowly, letting it hang there like a warning. I glanced past her again, catching sight of the same lawnmower guy who'd been adjusting his mower earlier. Now he was leaning on it, openly watching us, eyes flicking between me and her like he knew exactly what kind of conversation this was. It was tempting to just call her out right there, but I wanted to see how far she'd go. How soon do you need it? I asked, keeping my tone flat. Her pen tapped against the paper again. By 5. Today. And if I don't? She hesitated, then gave a small shrug. Things might take longer for you. Approvals. Access to amenities. That sort of thing. Ah, there it was. The soft threat wrapped in polite language. I'd seen that play before. Use fear of inconvenience to push people into paying. I crossed my arms, letting a small smile creep onto my face. So, you're saying this is mandatory? Absolutely, she said without missing a beat. And every new resident has paid it? Of course. Everyone. That was a lie I could prove in seconds. I'd personally handled lease agreements for 2 properties here within the last year. Neither of those residents had paid a dime in initiation fees. But I didn't call her on it yet. I just let the silence stretch again, long enough for her to start shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She was good at keeping her voice steady, but her body language was starting to betray her. It's funny how people change when they think they're in control versus when they start to lose it. Her sentences got shorter. Her eyes darted away more often. And her smile, once wide and confident, was beginning to tighten at the edges. Meanwhile, I was thinking about the folders sitting on my laptop. The HOA's payment records. Their rent disbursement logs. And the contracts showing exactly how much they relied on the properties I managed. If she knew that I wasn't just a random homeowner, if she knew that the cash she was demanding was pennies compared to the checks that cross my desk every month, she might have picked a very different tone for this little welcome visit. But she didn't know. Not yet. And I wasn't about to ruin the surprise. Not until she finished digging her own hole a little deeper. I stepped back from the door, just enough to grab my laptop bag from the hallway. Her eyes followed the motion, maybe thinking I was going for my wallet. Instead, I pulled out my laptop, set it right on a stack of unopened boxes, and flipped it open. The sound of it powering on filled the silence between us. Her pen stopped tapping. She adjusted her clipboard like she was suddenly unsure what to do with her hands. You know, I said, casually logging in, I handle quite a few properties around here. She tilted her head. Oh, yeah, I continued, my fingers moving across the keyboard. In fact, I work directly with your HOA. That was the first crack. It was quick, just a flicker in her eyes, but it was there. The confident, polished mask she'd been wearing all this time slipped just a little. I clicked into a folder labeled HOA, Contracts and Payments. Rows of PDFs popped up on the screen. Leases. Payment histories. Internal notes. I turned the laptop slightly, so she could see without making it too obvious I was showing her. This is interesting, I said, scrolling slowly. Because according to these official documents, ones your board signed, there's no such thing as a new resident initiation fee. Her fingers tightened around the pen. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The kind of pause where the next sentence is being carefully rebuilt in their head. Maybe you're looking at an old version, she said finally, forcing a smile. No, I replied evenly. This is from last month. She glanced toward the street, maybe looking for an escape route, maybe hoping someone else would walk up and bail her out. No one did. Even the lawnmower guy had gone back to pretending he wasn't listening, though I could still see him glancing over every few seconds. You see, I said, leaning back against the doorframe, when you manage rentals, you get to know the rules pretty well. And when some of those rentals are inside an HOA, you tend to pay attention to the fine print. I let that sit for a moment before adding, especially when the people trying to collect fees from you are the same people who send rent checks to your office every month. That's when the real crack appeared. Her eyes widened slightly, her pen dropped just a fraction from the paper, and for the first time since she knocked on my door, she didn't have something rehearsed to say. You work with the board? She asked, but her tone was different now. Less confident. More careful. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at my laptop screen and started clicking through a few more files. Not just with them, I said finally, but with the owners of several houses here. Which means if I ever had reason to, I could make sure certain payments don't go through quite as smoothly as usual. Her mouth opened again, but nothing came out. For a second, it looked like she might try to laugh it off, but even she seemed to realize how poorly that would land. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the sound of it clicking shut fill the space between us. I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding, I said, my tone neutral but not warm. She nodded quickly. Too quickly. Yes, of course. Probably just a mix-up. I'll check with the office. She took a step back, and then another, her smile now nothing more than a polite formality. The clipboard stayed tucked against her chest like a shield as she mumbled something about welcoming me to the neighborhood and turned to leave. I stood there, watching her walk away, her shoulders just a little hunched now. She didn't look back once. Not when she reached the sidewalk. Not when she rounded the corner. Inside, my boxes were still stacked high, the moving truck still waiting. But somehow, unpacking didn't feel quite as urgent anymore. The street felt different after she left. It wasn't quieter. If anything, I could hear more now. The hum of the moving truck. The faint chatter of neighbors just far enough away to pretend they weren't talking about me. The soft buzz of a sprinkler system across the road. I could feel eyes on me from behind blinds and half-open windows. People here had seen this before. That much was obvious. And judging by the way the lawnmower guy gave me a slight nod before going back to his work, I wasn't the first target of this so-called initiation fee. I took my time closing the door, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to let anyone watching see that I wasn't rattled. If anything, I was curious now. Curious about how many times this little routine had worked for them. Inside, I set my laptop on the counter and poured myself a glass of water. The adrenaline was still running high, but underneath it was a deep, steady confidence. The kind you get when you know you're standing on solid ground, and the other person doesn't even realize how much you already know. I opened my email and scrolled through my work folders until I found what I was looking for, a list of properties in this HOA that I managed. 7 homes. 7 separate contracts. 7 streams of rent money that, in one way or another, passed through my office before it ever touched the HOA's hands. And now, one of their own reps had just tried to scam me for pocket cash. I didn't even need to make a call to the board to know how that would look. The thing about HOAs is that they operate on reputation and authority. They rely on people believing their rules are unshakable, their power absolute. But the moment someone pushes back with actual knowledge of the bylaws, the whole facade starts to crack. By the time I stepped back outside to tell the movers they could start unloading, word had already started to spread. A man walking his dog slowed down near my driveway, gave me a knowing smirk, and muttered just loud enough for me to hear. Guess she picked the wrong one. I didn't answer, just smiled and kept walking. While the movers carried in boxes, I noticed more faces appearing at windows, more subtle waves from people who seemed suddenly interested in making eye contact. It was like I'd passed some unspoken test, one that separated the pushovers from the people who'd fight back. One woman from 2 houses down wandered over, carrying a plate covered in foil. She introduced herself, offered me the cookies, and leaned in a little as she whispered. She tried the same thing on me. My husband paid her. We didn't know any better. I asked if they'd ever gotten a receipt. They hadn't. 2 more neighbors stopped by before the movers finished. Both had similar stories, different amounts, different excuses, but always cash, always on the first day. Some had even been told they couldn't use the community pool until they settled the balance. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system. And it was working, until today. I didn't tell anyone yet about my connection to the HOA's rent money. That was a card worth keeping close. But I made a mental note of every detail my neighbors shared, every dollar amount, every name they remembered. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew leverage when I saw it. By late afternoon, the last box was inside, the truck was gone, and the sun was starting to drop behind the rooftops. The air had cooled just enough to make the street feel still. Somewhere in that quiet, I knew she was talking to someone, maybe the board president, maybe another rep, trying to figure out how much I really knew. What she didn't realize was that the question wasn't how much I knew. It was what I was willing to do with it. The next morning, I was up early. Not because I had anywhere to be, but because I wanted to see the neighborhood wake up. From my front porch, I watched sprinklers rotate across perfect lawns, kids shuffle sleepily into cars for school, and the occasional jogger wave politely without slowing down. But there was one thing I didn't see, her. No blue polo, no clipboard, no fake smile. If she was out here, she was keeping a low profile. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen counter, laptop open again. A quick search pulled up the HOA's official website. Sure enough, the rules were still exactly as I remembered. No mention of initiation fees, cash payments, or any of the nonsense she'd tried to feed me. I wasn't looking for confirmation. I already had that. What I wanted now was names. The list of board members was right there, president, treasurer, secretary, and a few at-large members. Some of them I recognized from paperwork. One in particular I recognized from being late on payments, more than once. It was almost too easy. I clicked through a few more tabs until I found the public meeting schedule. The next board meeting was in 4 days. Public attendance was encouraged. That was good to know. By mid-morning, I had company again. Not the kind with clipboards. This time, it was another neighbor, a man in his 50s with a faded baseball cap, and the kind of sunburn you only get from years of yard work. He introduced himself as Tom, said he'd heard I stood my ground yesterday. About time someone did, he added, leaning on my fence. Turns out, Tom had lived here for almost a decade. He'd seen this little scam run more times than he could count. It wasn't always her. Sometimes it was a different rep, but the routine was the same. Target new arrivals, collect cash, and keep it off the books. I asked if anyone had ever taken it up with the board. He laughed, short and bitter. Some tried. But the people running this? They're connected. Complaints disappear before they ever make it on an agenda. That told me a lot. This wasn't just one rogue rep pocketing a little extra on the side. This was something the board either knew about or didn't care enough to stop. After Tom left, I took a slow walk around the block. People were friendlier now, more nods, more waves, even a couple of short chats about the weather. It was like news of what happened yesterday had traveled faster than the mail. And with every polite smile, I caught the same unspoken question in their eyes. What are you going to do about it? I wasn't in a hurry to answer that, not yet. Right now, I was still gathering pieces. Every story a neighbor told me was another piece of the puzzle. Every whispered detail about fees or lists or special charges gave me more to work with. By the time I made it back to my house, I had a clearer picture than ever. This HOA wasn't just strict, they were opportunistic. And they were counting on the fact that most people either didn't know the rules well enough or didn't want the hassle of fighting back. What they didn't count on was someone who already had the rulebook memorized and the financial connections to make life very inconvenient for them. Late that afternoon, as the sun started to dip, I saw her again. She was walking briskly down the opposite sidewalk, head down, avoiding eye contact. Her clipboard was gone, replaced by a reusable grocery bag, like she was suddenly just another resident running errands. She didn't wave. Neither did I. But I knew she saw me. And I knew she was wondering how much I'd told the neighbors. The truth was, I'd told them less than I could have. For now. 2 days later, a plain white envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address, no HOA logo, just my name printed neatly in the center. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a formal font, apologizing for any miscommunication during my move-in process. It didn't mention her name, didn't mention the fee, and didn't mention the fact that they'd been caught. But the tone was clear. This wasn't an apology for what happened. It was a quiet attempt to make the whole thing go away. I read it twice, then set it down on the counter. The timing was interesting. 2 days was just enough for word to spread around the board, for calls to be made, for someone to realize they'd picked the wrong resident to pressure. That evening, I took another walk. It wasn't about exercise. I wanted to see who would approach me now. Sure enough, I didn't make it past the second house before a woman in a garden apron stepped out and asked if I was the one who stood up to the HOA lady. Her words, not mine. We talked for a while. She told me her daughter had been charged the same initiation fee when she moved in last year. Paid in cash, never got a receipt. When they asked about it at the next board meeting, they were told it was part of the move-in packet. They never saw it in writing, but they didn't push it further. More stories kept coming as I moved down the block. A retired couple fined for non-compliant mailbox paint that turned out to be the exact same color as everyone else's. A single mom charged for emergency landscaping when she was out of town, work that never actually happened. By the time I made it back home, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me. The HOA here had been running little games like this for years. Sometimes it was a fake fee, sometimes it was a bogus fine, sometimes it was an empty threat about amenities or inspections. Always just small enough that most people paid up to avoid trouble. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The folder I'd opened in front of her on move-in day was still there, full of contracts, payment logs, and HOA correspondence. But now, I started a new folder, one labeled HOA Patterns. Every detail I'd heard from neighbors went in there. Dates, amounts, names, specific language they'd been told. Even small things, like the way one neighbor said the rep always showed up in the first 48 hours after a move-in. It wasn't just a record, It was a map of their habits. And somewhere in all of that, I knew I'd find the weak point. The one thing they couldn't spin, deny, or make disappear. The funny thing is, I still hadn't decided exactly how I wanted to play this. I could have gone straight to the board with what I had. I could have filed a formal complaint with the state HOA Oversight Division. I could have even made it a legal matter. But there was something satisfying about letting them sit with the uncertainty. They didn't know how much I knew. They didn't know what I was planning. They didn't know how many of their own residents had started quietly talking to me. That night, as I sat on my porch with the last of my coffee, I saw her again. She was across the street this time, walking with another woman I didn't recognize. They kept their voices low, but their glances in my direction gave them away. I didn't wave. I didn't say a word. I just let them see me sitting there, calm and unbothered, like I had all the time in the world. Because the truth was, I did.